Thank you for joining me for this Lifeway study of the book of Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. This is session 8. The title is Consequences. The text is Judges chapter 2, verse 11 to 23. And the lesson summary statement is, after Joshua's death, Israel fell into a cycle of sin, judgment, confession, and restoration. I'm going to use the suggestion that's found in Explore the Bible, where it talks about the transition between the two CEOs at Apple. And of course, the way they recommend you start the lesson is just ask people, how many of you have Apple products? And there's just a whole list of things. Of course, the phones and the watches and the iPads and so forth. And then that leads into the discussion about the changing and the transition that's taking place with leadership. And that's going to lead me to ask them, have you ever worked at a place where they changed bosses, or maybe the company changed owners? And I would like to know, was it better or was it worse? And why did you feel that it was better or worse? Just to get some discussion going. And then that leads into me saying a transition is taking place. Israel is drifting away from its godly leaders that had led them into conquering the land. And the reason they're drifting away is because of partial obedience. They don't drive out the Canaanites. And I want to take them to the first chapter and just show them a few of the verses. Chapter 1, verse 19, verse 21, verse 27, and it goes on. And it shows that the people didn't complete the job of driving the Canaanites out of the land. And that comes back later to have a terrible impact upon them. And this sets up this reoccurring pattern of compromise and sin. Now, the book of Judges covers about 300 years from 1350 to 1050 BC. And what follows after that is the time of the kings. Judges confirms that God's promise of the land was fulfilled, and Judges also confirms that the God they're dealing with is a just God and a merciful God. The transition sentence on page 91 says, the book of Judges focuses on the cycle of sin of the Israelites and the rescue that God provides through his judges. So the first point is the evil. Judges chapter 2, verse 11 through 5. And I want to just go through and give some explanation that's found in this text to give it some fullness and context and to help them see the power of what's taking place here. Just a few things. The Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight. Now that basically boils down the whole book of Judges. They worshiped the Baals and abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors who brought them out of Egypt. And I want to just stop there and help them to see this tremendous contrast that is being made. They worshiped the Baals. They served him. They gave their allegiance to this God, to the various gods that represent the Baal gods. They devoted themselves, in contrast to the God that had rescued them out of Egypt. The word abandon is a word that I want to zero in on. The idea of this word means a change in relationship. And the same word is used to describe a primary allegiance that changes. And it can be used in a positive sense, in the sense of a husband leaves his parents and cleaves to his wife. And it is this word that is used here, but it can also be in a negative sense, and it's the way it's being used here. And the clear message is the Israelites changed their allegiance from favoring the God that rescued them to these paganite gods of the Canaanites, and they forsook their relationship with the Lord. The idea of abandonment, think about that word. When it comes to relationships, there's just no good picture of that. It's always a shocking picture. We hear stories of children that have been abandoned in their homes by their parents for days on end, and they're hungry, and they're not cared for. We know of stories where a woman cared for her husband and worked and put him through school and had his children. And then when he finally got to a place where he could return the favor and bless her, he abandoned her for another woman. It's a picture of someone who forsakes and betrays. And it's a very powerful picture. And I'm wanting to help flesh that out. I'm wanting them to see that the God they left was a God of goodness and holiness and righteousness and abundant provision. And look at what they went to, the gods of Baal. And I want to ask the class to help me understand, what were the gods of Baal like? And many of them will remember the worship of the gods of Baal involved temple prostitutes and all kinds of sexual perversity. There was nothing that was beyond the human imagination. Some of those gods would involve child sacrifice. It's just, they were the most vulgar, most horrific kinds of gods that human beings could ever imagine. That's what they left God to go to. And so I want them to sense the evil of what is taking place here. And then it says they followed other gods from the surrounding peoples and bowed down to them. Now they followed. That means they didn't just drift into this. They actively pursued after these gods. And they went after the gods of the surrounding people, the very people that they had captured, the very people they had taken away their land from. And it says they bowed down. They gave him reverence and devotion to these gods. Now notice, this doesn't surprise us. They angered the Lord, for they had abandoned him and worshipped Baal and the Ashtaroths. And your commentary gives you information about those as well. But the word angered meant obviously that God was opposing this kind of behavior. The Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he handed them over to marauders who raided them. He sold them to the enemies around them, and they could no longer resist their enemies. Now, here's the interesting thing. The reason why they pursued after the god of Baal is he was a fertility god, and so was Ashtaroth, and they had the belief, the pagans had the belief, that these gods are the ones who gave them abundant crops and increased their herds and gave them children. And so if they would express worship to these gods, then they would materially succeed. And so that's what they were doing. And the actual result was God handed them over to marauders, and these people would come and they actually took away what they thought they were going to get. So it was illogical of what took place. Those gods couldn't protect them from the Israelites. What made them think that they could protect them from their enemies? And it says they sold them. That word sold is the picture of a slave. And so what they had is a relationship as a slave to a master. They were completely concerned with the other things of the master. Verse 15, whenever the Israelites went out, the Lord was against them and brought disaster on them, just as he promised and sworn. And he did that many times previously. God had told them that if you don't obey me, I will remove you from the land. I will take away your peace and your prosperity. And that's exactly what happened. And so they suffered greatly. The word there, suffered greatly, it pictures narrowness, or in terms of circumstances. It's like a vice that kept putting more and more pressure on the people. Also, an increase in anxiety because there was no way to escape. This was just miserable. So I want to go through that, and I want to engage the class, and I want to give some fuller explanations of the text and try to help them see why this title calls it evil. It's just simply illogical. It is immoral. It is offensive. It's rebellious. It's traitorous what they have done to God. It is evil. Now, these items that I'm going to share with the class are things that we often forget. And when we forget them, life gets complicated. And so I'm wanting the class to take these items and connect them with spiritual forgetfulness. And so I have 5 items that I'm going to have before the class. And I may give these to different groups and ask them to come up with some application of this, or I may just do it with the whole group. It depends because of the size of the group. But for example, keys. What happens when we forget our keys? Obvious. Well, if you were to use that as a spiritual application, what happens when we forget God? Then glasses. What happens if you forget your glasses? Well, you can't see very clearly. Well, what happens? How would that spin out into an application in terms of our spiritual forgetfulness, where we begin to not see clearly what's true and what's right, what's most important? A wallet. A wallet is an item of identification. What happens if you forget who you are as the people of God? What would be the impact of that? Fourth is a pill bottle. Pill bottles, that's about our health. What happens if you forget those things that create spiritual health? And the last one is a phone charger. I think maybe these are things that all of us have one time or another forgotten. And so what I'm trying to drive home is their decision to walk away from God had a big impact upon their lives. In fact, it actually was the opposite of what they were expecting. And it was evil. The evil wasn't a one-time failure on the part of these people. The evil became a repeating pattern. And that leads us to the second point, the cycle. And again, I want to read through this. I want to make some observations about the text. But what I'm wanting to do, I'm just wanting the class to help me pull out the cycle that's happening here. There's a rebellion. There is sometimes there's repentance. In this particular case, there's not. There's God's rescue. There's restoration. I'm wanting us to just walk through and see from this passage the cycle that happens, because this cycle is going to be repeated, as you know, throughout the book of Judges. And then after we've had time to deal with the text, I want to just ask them, this kind of seems to be a safe way to get into more application. When they look at the United States, where do they see our nation drifting? Where do they see us on this cycle that's happening here? And you can have some interesting discussions with that. And then from that, I want them to finish these sentences as way of application. Now look at the lesson summary statement. After Joshua's death, Israel fell into a cycle of sin, judgment, confession, and rebellion. Look at the application point. It says believers can be assured that God's faithfulness to act on behalf of his people is rooted in his character and not ours. And so I'm wanting to drive that particular point home with the class. So here are some sentences that I want them to finish these sentences in their own words and their own experiences. Here's the first sentence. God has been more faithful to me than. How would you complete that sentence? It might be something as simple as, then I have been faithful to him. There would be some other things you could add to that. Here's the second sentence. My ups and downs never changed. How would you say that? You never changed his faithfulness to me. I'm wanting to drive home the idea of the faithfulness of God's character. The third sentence. When I look back over my life, I can see God pursuing me even when. How would you finish that sentence? Even when I was not pursuing him, I showed no interest in him. Even when I ignored him, God, I can look back over my life and I can see that God was pursuing me. Here's a fourth sentence. Every rescue in my life is proof that. How would you finish that sentence? Again, there would be a number of ways that could finish that. But what I'm wanting to help the class to see is God's faithfulness. This is his character. And the last one is God's faithfulness is rooted in his character, not, how would you finish that? Not in my character. So believers can be assured that God's faithfulness to act on behalf of this people is rooted in his character and not ours. Every one of our answers shows the same truth Israel learned in Judges. God's faithfulness is anchored in his character. And that's why he keeps reaching for us. And that's why he keeps pursuing us. And that's why he keeps calling us. Because this is the character of God, a God of mercy and love and grace, even in the midst of judgment. So that's the cycle. The third point is the declaration. Now God is going to declare how he's going to deal with Israel going forward. We've seen the evil that they've committed. We've looked at the cycle that Israel repeated. And now God declares his judgment and the purpose for his testing. And so I want to read through that text and help make that clear, what God's declaration is about that, about his purpose for testing and the fact that he is going to be judging them. Now, the Teacher's Guide has this question on page 97. Why is disobedience such a big deal with God? I'd like to discuss that. Why is disobedience such a big deal with God? Well, one is our sin reveals our heart, and his response to our sin reveals his heart. One of the reasons why disobedience is a big deal with God is the testing reveals whether we are trusting him or trusting ourselves. The second question there says, how can sin spiral us away from God today? So that's what I'm looking for. What you see in this text, and it'll come out in the previous text as you study through it, is the ancestors. They were disobedient to God, and he had to bring judgment. But there was a spiral that was upward as they sought to be obedient to God. In these 300 years of the book of Judges, the spiral is downward to where when you come to the end of the book, these people do not even look like the people of God in terms of their disobedience to God. So how can sin spiral us away from God? What I'm driving at here is when there's sin in our life, we're going to be neglecting prayer. Prayer is not going to be something comfortable for us. We're going to be compromising with our faith when we let sin spiral us away from God. We're going to have maybe resentments instead of trusting God. There's going to be a dependence on self-reliance instead of trusting God. So that's what I'm asking. How does sin spiral us away from God? Now, the purpose of testing is to reveal the spiraling that's taking place in our life so that we can restore ourselves back to a relationship with God. Again, the application point on page 97 for this point says, believers can expect their obedience to God to be tested. So if you looked at that statement and you saw it in a positive way, not in a frightening way, a negative way, but you looked at that statement, believers can expect their obedience to God to be tested. What would be encouraging about that statement? These are the things I'm thinking of. It reveals that God's committed to our growth. He tests us so that we'll grow. It reveals, if God's testing me and in my obedience, it reveals that he is involved in my life. Another thing, if God is testing us in our obedience, it means that he's protecting me by showing me areas that I may be getting into that would spiral me into sin. It's also revealing my heart. When God tests me, he shows me what my real heart's like. When God tests me, he's teaching me. That's what I'm wanting to pull out of the class. If you looked at that statement in a positive way, What is it that God's doing in our life? Now, to close the lesson, I want the class to write down 2 statements. And they can write this in their personal study guide. The first statement is this: your failures don't cancel His promises. Your failures don't cancel His promises. Isn't it amazing that despite all of their sin, they still have the land, and He calls and He lets them stay in the land? Number 2, your obedience will be tested, but you will never be abandoned. Your obedience will be tested, but you will never be abandoned. So I'm asking the class this week, as you reflect back upon this lesson, I'd like for you to remember these 2 things. Your failures don't cancel His promises. And 2, your obedience will be tested, but you will never be abandoned. Thank you for teaching God's Word. Isn't it a wonderful calling from God to be called, and a wonderful responsibility to be given the responsibility of shepherding God's people? God bless you.